my armchair travel or journey to my next read. For some reason, I just found myself being Goldilocks. Wah, 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 wah. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the books I just recently finished. Armchair travel, going places in your books, with your books, all the things above. All right, I'm going to talk to you about two books that I finished, my journey and Goldilocks experience getting to the second book that I finished. And yeah, I'll give you a real quick glimpse of what I'm reading as well. So let's go ahead and get started. The first book I finished since last talking to you is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Sorry, I've got a stack of books here and they're just being wild. But A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I was talking to you about this, or mentioned in my last weekly reading wrap up, that I had just recently finished this book, or I was in the middle of it. I finished it. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I finished this book. So let me tell you what it's about. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is a coming of age story about Frances Nolan, who is a third generation German Irish American growing up in 1912 or early 1900s Brooklyn, and it follows her life from about the age of 9 to 19. I really enjoyed this book, as many people told me I would, and I can definitely see why. So let me talk to you about the highs in this book for me. I think first and foremost, and probably overwhelmingly so, would be the setting and world that this book takes place in. Clearly, according to the title, it is set in Brooklyn. Again, like I mentioned, in the early 1900s. I think the furthest you go back is like 1912. And Betty Smith just did a fantabulous job of building that experience of living in Brooklyn, what life was like in Brooklyn. I felt like you could smell it, you could see it, you were there, you were on the street, you were in the tenement apartments. I really enjoyed that experience. I thought she did such a good job of giving you just enough description and feel of the place without bogging you down with unnecessary details. You not only get some description of what a Brooklyn tenement neighborhood would look like, you also get to experience the ups and downs of living in the city at that time. You hear about different modes of transportation that existed and how people would get around. You also get a lot of historical background about what was going on in New York City, in the country, in the world at that time, but most specifically, what was going on in Brooklyn in the early 1900s. I think Betty Smith did a great job with portraying the culture and the language and the people that lived in Brooklyn at that time. New York City is made up of a lot of different boroughs, and for a very long time, and to a decent extent still now, those boroughs tend to be populated just by sort of a couple of cultures. And so you do get that sense very much so in this book, where there is a sort of Irish neighborhood, if you will. There is a Jewish population that is very much prevalent in Brooklyn. And you also get to experience the tension that exists between all these cultures there, and the prejudices that people have with these other neighboring cultures. And just, despite the idea of America being the great mixing pot, how like that really wasn't happening. People were kind of staying to themselves and tensions arise, but then they're still working together because they're all in the same community. People have different jobs. They need to support one another in that sense. Beyond just the world and that she built in this book and describes to you, I think you also get a really heartwarming experience of living inside a family in this book. In a lot of ways, I feel like she telescopes you into New York City, into Brooklyn, into the tenements, and then into the Nolan family specifically. You get to meet the charming yet not quite stable father. You get to see the very strong mother, as well as meet her sisters and the rest of the Romley family, which is the mother's family. And you get to see Frances and her brother grow up. And you just spend a lot of time with this family, and you get to know them very well. They become very important to you. I feel like she does a good job of getting you invested, not just in Frances, but really in the outcome of her entire family and their lives and what they're doing. You get to see see very close up what kind of work they would do as a poor family living in Brooklyn, the kind of struggles that they would have, how they are helped by their neighbors and their family, and just the lengths that people would go to in Brooklyn to get what they need, how difficult it was to survive during this time without a lot of wealth, as well as their triumphs and successes. And all of these, I just felt like I just, wanted everyone to do well. There were a lot of, morally gray characters, but not in a dark, bad manner, just in a more complex character type of way. I think the biggest low for me, and mind you, it wasn't that low, but if I had to pick something that wasn't my favorite, I would say it was some of the language and writing style. First of all, some of the word choice. There are a few characters in here who are very anti-Semitic. There's a lot of racial prejudice going on in general because that was part of what was going on in Brooklyn. But I did find that the book as a whole tended to focus a lot more heavily on Jewish people and even describe them in anti-Semitic ways, which the reason I think this was a low for me, beyond just, not liking to read that, was also because there's a very fine line between characterizing somebody as it being from another character's viewpoint and it seeming like your narrator or your author is characterizing a person in that way. And I don't know that that balance was always well reached, particularly at the very beginning of the book, which is when Frances is 9, and she definitely has inherited some of her own family's prejudices, but I just don't think the distinction there is very well made. And so that initially gave me pause with this book, but I kept reading and I do think it got worked out later on, but it did make that part of the book a little awkward. That's not to say that the language in here or the writing overall is not good. She has some really great moments. One example I can think of is when she talks about the tree in Brooklyn. Absolutely astounding, beautiful writing. However, that gets balanced out by the internal dialogue in this book. Oh my gosh, guys, it was bad. There just came a point in the book where I was like, stop talking to yourself, because every time Frances would think a thought inside her head or another character would have any sort of internal dialogue with themselves, it just became super clunky. And you just felt like the fourth wall was being broken down and that Betty Smith was just telling you, now, this is the lesson I want you to learn, kids, is that education is really important. It was annoying. Like, it was Charlie Brown's teacher, wah, 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 wah. Like, can you tell it annoyed me? And it started like that, and it just got progressively worse as the book went on. And by the end, I wanted to start skimming the parts where there would be internal dialogue because it was just so preachy and clunky. And I don't know what happened. I feel like there were times where she just forced her message into her character's thoughts because she wanted them into the book and just couldn't figure out a way to just like gracefully put them in there. And there is a lot of internal dialogue in here because you are primarily in Frances's point of view, and it just didn't work. The rest of the dialogue was fine, so I'm not sure why when Frances spoke to herself, she like couldn't get it together. That does bring me to Frances herself. She does age from about 9 to 19 throughout the book, and I could tell that Betty Smith was trying to do different things with the writing style to help you experience that age and that aging. And so it was like clearly, Frances is going to speak at 9 differently than she does when she is 19. And one of the ways that it seemed like Betty Smith tried to communicate that was by changing the writing style of Frances. You do have a very sort of childish, but not overly so, voice at the beginning of the book, and definitely a childish perspective at the beginning of the book in terms of what she focuses on and thinks is important, and the amount of inferences that she can or can't make about what's going on around her. You get some diary entries, when she's sort of a preteen, which I felt like was appropriate, and you definitely get a bit more of a mature style later on. However, I felt like there were too many times where Betty Smith played around not just with the voice of the character, but just also the syntax and the writing style, and tried different formats. And not like, and they weren't super obvious, but they were just obvious enough that it started to make the book feel chaotic to me, particularly from about the middle to the end. And I felt like if she had just stayed at least with one format of writing, that it would have reduced that a bit. Overall, however, I really did enjoy this book. I think it's a really good work, and I can see why it is a classic and why a lot of people like it. I gave this book 4 stars. It covers a whole bunch of ideas that I think would be really appealing to people, including discussing thoughts about family, education, poverty. Definitely talks about Brooklyn in the early 1900s. It discusses coming of age, family and marriage, and just ideas surrounding morality and ethics and who gets to decide that and that kind of thing. I think this is a book that is both memoir-like, even though it is a work of fiction, it feels like somebody's memoir. So if you like that type of work, or you'd like to read a time capsule about Brooklyn in the early 1900s, or have always wanted to visit New York City, it's definitely a way to armchair travel and go back in time to a very sort of quaint version of New York City. That is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I would definitely recommend it to people who are interested in that kind of thing. There is a decent amount of plot in here, though it's definitely mostly character-based. And that brings me to the discussion of my armchair travel or journey to my next read. So I have a TBR that I make each month, which gives me a nice stack of books to pick from. But this month, for some reason, I just found myself being Goldilocks. And I was just on the hunt for my baby bear book. And I was just stumbling into Mama and Papa Bears, and I just had a ever-growing list of excuses. This was too hot, it was too cold. Like, let me go through it with you real quickly. So I started with my next book being The Terror, and it turned out that the characters in those books were not worth saving. Like, I didn't care about any one of them. They were all horrible, despicable people as far as I got in the book, and I was like, I cannot continue. And then in a very vapid and not deep way, let me go through all the other books that I tried after that. I went to Year of Wonders. This book was too sad for right now. I'll come back to it in the autumn. I tried The Ordeal of Richard Feverell. This book turned out to be too dusty and was trying to kill me. I moved on to Evelina, and this book is too similar to another book that I'm reading, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I picked up American Gods, and this book and author, well, they're just too much. Just too much. I just couldn't. And that brought me to my baby bear book, which turned out to be just right, and that is Orbital by Samantha Harvey. And I read this book, and let me tell you about it. So, Orbital, this was the winner of the 2024 Booker Prize. And at the end of last year, I did a video, or sometime last year, I did a video on the Booker Prize books that I have read, what were hits, what were misses, and it made me realize that I do want to start reading more of the Booker Prize books, especially the ones that I was interested in off the shortlist even before they've won. And this was a book that ever since hearing about it, I've wanted to read. And so when I saw that it won the Booker Prize, I went, okay, now I definitely need to pick it up. And I did, and I'm so glad I did. I absolutely loved this book. I haven't heard a ton about this book, but in brief, I could say that this book is about one day and 16 orbits around the Earth with 6 cosmonauts. And that's probably the most straightforward description I can give you of this. They are just observing what's going around them. You get to hear their observations. You get to make observations yourself through the narrator, and it is all just beautifully described. So let me talk about the highs in this book. First and foremost, I have to say, just like A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, this book is largely about the setting that you are in. It is about the world that she has built. And I have to say, for a book that takes place in a environment with no atmosphere, this is an extremely atmospheric book. It was just so descriptive that I felt like I was in space. I felt like the chill of the idea of outer space. I felt like I was looking down at the Earth. I felt like I was in an enclosed spaceship or space station, not in a claustrophobic way, just in an intimate way. The setting is very floating and free moving, of course, because you're in a space station and they're all floating around, but somehow she gives you that sense as well that you're kind of floating around with them. The things that she shares, at least to me, were very mind-boggling. I don't tend to read a lot of science fiction that is just about being out in space, and certainly haven't really read any nonfiction about it, but there were points in here, and I did annotate it. There are points in this book that were just mind-boggling information about being out in space. And I heard some different controversy or thoughts or whatever from people about how accurate some of this may or may not be. And in the end, I realized that didn't really matter to me because that wasn't the purpose of this book. This is not a book that was intending to be like 100% accurate. I think for me, the import of that information was it made me more curious about what it was like to be a cosmonaut, what it's like to be an astronaut, what it's like to be in outer space as one of these scientists. And I think that's something that is priceless and that this book does very well. She shares just enough details about that it makes you want to look up and learn more. I think the other key high in this book is definitely the language. It is poetic, it flows really smoothly. It's almost, but not quite, stream of consciousness. You definitely go inside the heads of many of the 6 characters in this book, though not necessarily all of them. And I say it's flowing and that the environment is floating because the way she writes this book, I really felt like I was floating around the space station with them, and sometimes as an outside observer, sometimes going into them. It was a very interesting and bizarre situation. And this is a book where I think the points of view change and the formatting even changes sometimes, but it was done so well. So for me, this is a distinction between how that was done in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Here, she changed the formatting. At one point, you just occasionally get list of things, but I enjoyed it. I liked it. I felt like the way that she kind of went from point of view to point of view worked really well, and that her writing style was good. It did occasionally border on being too purple prosy for me, or too beautiful, if you will, in some ways, but I think she kept it within bounds and it worked for me really well. The lows for me would be the characters themselves. There were times where I felt like maybe the characterization was just a little too flat and shallow, and that I wasn't as invested in them as individuals as I would have liked to have been, even though I really enjoyed them as a group. And saying I enjoyed them as a group reminds me that there is this one scene in here where they are watching a movie and she describes what they all look like at the end of the movie. And that was just an amazing description. So yeah, I enjoyed them as a group, both just her description of them as a group and how they interacted as a group. But I'm talking about lows. So the other low, not necessarily for me, but I think is something that could throw people off or might not be as enjoyable, would be the structure and the plot of this novel. It is not plot heavy at all. I would say it's also not really a character-driven book. I would oddly enough say that this book really is driven by the setting, which I feel like is kind of an oddball thing and not something that everybody is used to or would like. But I think if you come to this book, you are really there for the place that it is set in and how that setting impacts the characters and their actions. And so I would say that is a low, not for me personally. I ended up enjoying it, but I think it's something that could potentially be a turnoff for some people. That said, I did end up giving this book 4.5 stars. I loved the ideas of found family, space, time and space, time travel. No, there was no time travel in here. I don't know. I felt like I was traveling through time because there is a lot of discussion of time in here. And I think another concept that is covered in here is just the idea of beauty and awe in the world, in space, in Earth, in our universe, and all of those things. I would recommend this book to anyone who has ever wanted to be a cosmonaut or is interested in what goes on up in the space stations, what that is like. I would definitely recommend this to anyone who likes beauty in their books or likes really nice descriptions of settings. To anyone who is a really reflective reader and likes to read things and sit and pause and just think about what they've read, think about the description, think about the words, because that is what this book is about. And I would definitely recommend this to anyone who likes to armchair travel. That just seems to be the theme this week in my books, is if you want books that are going to take you places, I would recommend either one of these. They were both really good. Like I said, this one was a 4.5 for me. This was a 4. I think they're both really strong reads, and they take you to two very different places. So that is everything that I finished. Let me just show you real quickly my stack of what I'm currently reading. I am still doing my classical piece of music a day out of Year of Wonder. And in the midst of that, these are the books that I am currently working on. Some potentially more quickly than others, but they are all there in progress. And that's it for me. Let me know how your reading week has gone, and I will talk to you next time.